Welcome to the Feria TechCast, where we bring you all things science, engineering, technology, and innovation. Today we are joined by Dr. Thomas Sheahen, MIT educated physicist and author of the book Everywhen, Symmetry and Time. He focuses on how science and faith are compatible. So, Dr. Sheahen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ezekiel. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm equally glad to have you here. So, let's dive in. Your career spans deep work in physics, like superconductivity, and a deep lifelong faith. For many, these are like kind of different worlds for some people. So, when did you first realize that for you, they weren't just compatible, but actually illuminated one another?
Well, it has been a pathway my entire life in which I've questioned over and over about these things and come to these conclusions. It is the stereotype out there that science opposes religion. That's a very commonplace belief that people have when they don't know a whole lot about it. But what I found is that the arguments from religious faith are upheld by the observations of science. And that is a remarkable fact. It's a desirable outcome, certainly, but it is remarkable compared to the stereotype that causes people to think that science is always trying to knock down religion. And that is a problem that I think has been with many of us for centuries. But my own work and my interest in the coupling between faith and science shows that the stereotype is wrong. And in fact, science and religious faith support each other in the pursuit of knowledge and truth.
Fantastic. Could you kindly give us an overview of your book, Everywhen? So tell us what it's about and your motivation behind writing the book.
Sure. Okay. Everywhen is a word you haven't heard of. It doesn't exist in English or French, Chinese, anyplace else. And the reason, after all, everybody knows what everywhere means, but nobody knows what everywhen means. It's not a word. What's going on is the human being, all of us, are limited and live within space and time, and we are incapable of grasping all time in a comprehensive way. Notice I didn't say it once, I just in a comprehensive way. Now, God can understand all time. He is present all time. God is the creator of time. So God has a transcendent view of time that greatly exceeds ours. He watches on our wrist, and we see time going by linearly from one moment to the next, to the day, to the year, etc. But God is just as present to us today as he was 5,000 years ago to the ancient Hebrews. And this is something we as humans aren't able to get our mind around. So the word everywhen comes as a surprise. But this human deficiency, our inability to grasp how God sees time, causes all sorts of troubles for us. We make these inferior idols, shouldn't say idols, these models, these attempts to picture God that are very inferior to the reality that God actually is. And the biggest mistake of all is thinking that God lives within time. I have called time the falsest God of all because of the fact that when you think that God is within time, as contrasted to transcendent to time, the creator of time, then you think God is limited in very severe ways. And that leads you, the human observer, into all kinds of mistaken ideas and faulty images of God that just have terrible consequences for your ability to grasp and understand anything at all about God. So I'm trying to get people I can't tell you how God sees time. I'm not God, all right? I don't have that capability. But I do see the effect of this limitation, and I see that the deficiency on the part of human beings is causing this trouble. And that's what I want to encourage my readers to overcome and to understand. And frankly, I'm sure you've heard this from others before. When you're dealing with God, the one thing a human has to bring to the table is humility, because God's a whole lot smarter than us, and we must not pretend that we know a whole lot about God. But we can discover the things that we don't know and the failures and the limitations we have because of our language, our culture, our traditions, and everything that get in the way of actually having a grasp on the way God really sees all of nature. So that's the cornerstone of my book. And in there, I have chapters on the Big Bang, multiverse, evolution. I talk about how idolatry creeps into science, which is a very severe problem for science, because when idolatry creeps in, you don't recognize it sneaking in, and you start to believe in it, and you get into idolatry, which is a big mistake. So there are many topics covered, and the book is its outline or front end. The preface tells you about these. But the key thing that everybody needs to understand is to realize that we humans are limited. We are not able to understand God, and therefore we have to be cautious about the images we create and the models we make of God.
Okay, that's really interesting. So the title of your book, Everywhen, I'd say is quite a fascinating word. So from a physicist perspective, how does this concept of God's presence in all time relate to our scientific understanding of time as a dimension?
Okay. Um, that's the other word in the title, God's symmetry and time. God started off by creating concepts, okay? Philosophical concepts. He created the idea of symmetry, that there is such a thing as symmetry. At the Big Bang, God created space and time together. Now, that statement isn't a Tom Sheahen original. That was proposed by St. Augustine in the year 400 AD. Okay? Well, 1,500 years after St. Augustine, along came Albert Einstein, and he rediscovered this unusual unity between space and time, which is enabled what makes time a dimension. You know, we think about, up, down, sideways, left, right, etc., as the dimensions we know and understand perfectly well, but time is also a dimension. And it's right there in the equations of general relativity that Einstein came up with. So as a physicist, you learn this. You learn how to handle general relativistic concepts, and you understand things like that the universe, the dimensions themselves are expanding. Now think back to the time of Isaac Newton. He just thought that time and space were always there. They were like a coordinate system, and you couldn't do anything about it. But Einstein showed that no, actually, from the creation, from the Big Bang, that time has been going forward, but space has been getting larger. That's really tough for people to understand, but it's right there in the evidence of galaxies, galactic clusters, stars everywhere. It's out there in space, and you can definitely see it there. So this kind of physics is the sort of thing that is really exciting and interesting to all of us who are physicists. And to make the connection from there to religious faith is the next step. And it's an interesting step to take, because you recognize that as a human being, as a scientist, you don't know everything, and you aren't going to know everything. And so you begin to respect the things you don't know and the classes of information that you don't know. And that's where the classical pattern of religion, dating from clear back in the ancient Greeks, maybe before that, the Sumerians perhaps, that is where it comes in, that people have this understanding within themselves that there is more to life than just what we see before us. There are higher realities that aren't there in the things that are on the table in the laboratory or observed in nature. There's more to reality. And when you start to recognize that, then you begin to appreciate the fact that religion has something to say. And bringing religion and science together is, I think, a very worthwhile activity, and that's what I try to do. Now, do my fellow physicists do this? Not so many. Many have a compartmentalized idea that science is over here and the other things in life are over there, and we don't have to make them connected. Well, I think that's an incomplete life, that it's important to have this unity between science and the higher dimensions of life, the things that make a human being really human, which is much more than science alone. And our religious experience, religious understanding, our religious faith is what brings us into these higher domains.
That is wonderful, Tom. So the Big Bang is often presented as a point of conflict between science and faith. So how does your view as a physicist transform the Big Bang from a challenge to faith into what you call God's elegant creation?
If you assume that space and time were always there and that God lives within time, and at the outset I said that's a mistake, but if that's your point of view, you will then wind up with a whole bunch of questions about the Big Bang, etc. And you will ask, for example, what did God do before he created the universe? Well, that's a dumb question because the first thing God created was space and time, and the word before doesn't have any meaning until after time exists. So when you realize that God is transcendent and God is outside, over and above space and time, then the idea that God is the creator of these things begins to make very good sense. So at the Big Bang, the best physics we have is that there was an initial fireball. There was an incredible amount of energy all at one point. This is called the singularity, and the universe has continued from there. Nothing happened for, 100 billion years or so, but then little clusters and clouds of gas and dust started to form here and there. There began to be things collecting into large clouds that eventually turned into galaxies, and within the galaxies, individual stars formed, and so forth and so on. And the physics of all this is really very good, and it's right there in physics books. And it makes a wonderful thing to study. I mean, to understand this is a real delight. But the idea that this happened on its own or that God wasn't necessary is the kind of argument that is put forth by people who are in the secular humanist scientism type point of view, which is really an atheistic point of view. God either doesn't exist or that he doesn't matter. There was a view a couple hundred years ago during the Enlightenment called deism, where God supposedly kind of wound up the clock and then set it off and walked away from it and never came back again. That's a very, very limited view, a mistaken view, and one that comes from thinking that time and space were always there and that God is subordinate to time. So when you get above that, that's when you begin to be able to see that the symmetry principles that God created gave us all the laws of physics. Time and space, everything was God's creation right from the start, and that he put it all together in a way that is just incredibly creative, incredibly sophisticated, just astonishing in all that has come to be in the universe over the billions of years. And it's to a scientist who does see this, who has faith and understands the reality of God, it's absolutely magnificent. It's more than a beautiful day. It's more than a beautiful year. It is a stunning reality an understanding of God's creation is just magnificent. So it's a great outlook to have if you have it, which I do, and I'm really glad to tell people about it in the book Everywhen, God's Symmetry and Time. So time itself came from one of these symmetry principles. There's a symmetry between space and time, which we see in the equations of Einstein, but it's there, and it's just, to somebody with a mathematical understanding of relativity, it just stands up and shouts at you that this was done by a brilliant super intellect, a transcendent creator. So we've got a wonderful universe. We understand it in physics to a fair extent, but we admire it as the handiwork of our very creative, transcendent God.
Fantastic. So you said that human perception of time deflects us from understanding God. So as a physicist, what is it about our subjective experience of past, present, and future that you believe is so limited compared to the reality?
Well, from the human point of view, it's tough because we don't have any experience other than the consecutive passage of time. We have to read a history book to know anything about what happened 50 years, 1,000 years, a million years ago. If we study science with astronomy and geology and so forth, we can understand things that happened on the planet before, like 10,000 or a million years ago, but we cannot comprehend this in a united way. We see it as in a consecutive way. And that's what we as humans are stuck with. That's our life. It exists within time. But there are weird things that are true, and yet we can't get a grip around them. Let's say that you have a friend who's going in for a dangerous heart operation in a week or so. So you pray to God that God will protect this patient. Well, unbeknownst to you, God, who sees all time, can answer your prayer of today by having a child conceived back in about 1970 who turns out to grow up to be a brilliant surgeon and is going to be the one who is going to come in and operate on your loved one. That's what God can do. Can you, as a human being, understand that? Can you grasp time that way? No, you can't. I can't. None of us can. We pray about things in the future, okay? And that makes sense to us because if we say, God, please bring about such and such in the future, then, okay, if he's listening to you today, maybe he can do that. But to pray for something that depends upon God taking action in the past just boggles the human mind. We can't do it. And yet God is present to all time. He can. And, can I explain it better? No, I have to be humble. I have to admit that as a human being, this is beyond me. But I think I can grasp, particularly because I have humility about the difference between humans and God, that God has these capabilities that we cannot even imagine. And we as humans need to be really humble and appreciate that.
Okay, so I'd like to ask you a question, Tom. Looking back at your career, was there ever a specific scientific discovery or a moment in your research that felt like a spiritual revelation?
Golly, it is the case that because of my understanding of Einstein and relativity, I thought that I discovered all by myself independently that God created time and space at the same moment. Well, it turns out I was about 1,600 years late because it's right there in St. Augustine's books and from the year 400 AD. So I cannot claim this, but at least within my own mind at the time, it seemed like a really good original insight by me. So that might have been the moment you're looking for. As far as other things go, a lot of what I did was experimental work, laboratory research and so forth, studies and and programs and things like that to achieve things. There's an instrument called an interferometer, which was almost a laboratory curiosity well into the 20th century. And now it's used in all kinds of things like infrared spectroscopy and medical applications and so forth. In the latter half of the 20th century, interferometry became a really great science, important one with lots of applications. Well, I had the good fortune in the 1960s to be in on the change that came about that made interferometry useful again. It had to do with a computer program to take something known as the fast Fourier transform, revolutionized the business. And that was a place where I was pretty happy to be there. I was glad that I understood it. I was glad to participate in that kind of science. Now, that was a scientific insight and achievement. I was not the guy who did the really brilliant stuff. I appreciated that he did, and it was brilliant, but I can't claim that for my own. When I think about the connection between religion and science, the value of faith, there I've derived a lot of help from many scholars over the centuries. You can reach way back to Plato and Aristotle for the idea that man is more than just the molecules that make him up, more than just skin and bones. There are these higher dimensions, higher realities in which man functions. That goes way back to the Greeks. In more recent years, like 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago, St. Thomas Aquinas came along with a brilliant understanding. He called it Summa Theologica, put together an awful lot of what human beings understand about God in a brilliant synthesis. More people have come along since then. The astronomers have contributed quite a bit by their observations. So as we come up to the 20th and 21st centuries, we live in a world of much greater knowledge, and honestly, so much of this scientific knowledge keeps pointing directly to the idea that God created this universe and that God is brilliant and he's transcendent, and what he accomplished was so far beyond what our imagination could ever hold that all we can do is, as the song goes, when I, in awesome wonder, consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I say, my God, how great thou art. And that's the reaction that a scientist gets to the beauty of science that points towards God. And I'm happy to have been such a person that did that.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, how has your journey at the intersection of, science and faith changed the way you approach a scientific problem? Has it made you a different kind of physicist?
Sure, yeah. When I was young, I was mathematics everywhere, okay? At the MIT, golly, a lot of mathematics there. I just had this grasp, or this, no, what should I say? This feeling, this appreciation, this thinking that mathematics was going to someday explain everything. Well, it may interest you to know that back around the year 1600, a fellow named Galileo thought the same way about the value of mathematics. And so it's a commonplace thing that happens to scientists. They fall in love with mathematics and they think mathematics is the answer to everything. Well, that was when I was 17 or 20 years old. Okay, so as you can see on the screen, I'm a little older than that, right? Okay. Over the years, I began to appreciate the fact that we aren't just made of atoms and molecules. We are human beings and we are made of more. We have these higher dimensions or higher degrees of freedom, whichever you want to call it, in which we experience things like, first of all, we have memory, eyesight, hearing, and all these kind of things, but still keep going up on higher levels. And you'll come up to a level where we recognize as a human property things like love, loyalty, honor. These are concepts that don't apply to lower forms of life, okay? But they are there in the human being. And the human being has now entered into a realm that can only be called spiritual, because we do elevate our lives well above the material that is science. So in science, we do the best we can to understand nature and the nature of what we see before us. But when it comes to being a human being, appreciating humanity and appreciating our relationship with God, that's where we have to move up to these higher levels of existence and understand that we belong there. That's part of being a human being. So did I make that transition all of a sudden? Did I abandon math all of a sudden? No. All very gradual over time. And I cannot pinpoint a day on which I said this was the day in which I changed, because it was a gradual appreciation. And I think, frankly, many people in the world who have religious faith have similarly experienced a gradual appreciation of it, gradual transition. I'm glad to have been guided by good teachers all my life long. I've read some excellent books. Lonergan, a book called with the simple word insight. Very simple title, Insight by Lonergan, was a monumental treatise of the mid 20th century. And understanding all that he had to say about philosophy and theology and understanding God was incredibly valuable to me. But again, these things took place over periods of time, not in any lightning bolt way at all.
Fantastic. So, part of the theme of this podcast is centered around innovation. So, for that reason, I like to ask every guest that I interview on this podcast a question about innovation. So, tell us, in your life's work, bridging the worlds of quantifiable physics and spiritual faith. So, what does the word innovation mean when applied to understanding our universe and our place in it? I mean, from your own opinion, I'm not exactly asking for the definition of the word innovation. I just want to hear the way you, see it.
Well, it's something a new knowledge that you didn't have yesterday. Okay. It's an insight. It's an understanding that comes to you because of your ability to think creatively. Oftentimes it leads to some device, electrical, mechanical, computer, whatever, that has applications and is useful to mankind. But from just the science point of view alone, an innovation is a new understanding, a new appreciation. And these have come about in science over the centuries, again and again. Certainly, Isaac Newton's understanding was an innovation. Measurements that showed how things move. There's a museum in Florence, Italy, where you can go see the stuff that Galileo worked with to formulate the very earliest laws of motion in nature. Golly, it used to be thought that when something was burning, there was something called phlogiston playing a role. Well, over time, that got kicked out because people began to understand that it's the molecule oxygen that combines with other things, and that's the process of oxidation or burning. Another century went by, and we believed in the 19th century. Physicists believed in the ether, okay? Well, you haven't heard that lately because at the end of the 19th century, it was shown that the ether simply doesn't exist. When that happens, boy, you got to go back to the drawing board in a lot of ways. But it did happen. Certainly, Einstein's gravity understanding through general relativity was a brilliant innovation. Quantum mechanics in the 1920s and 30s, brilliant innovation. The understanding of nuclear physics in the latter 1930s. Golly, then you look at so many things that have taken place. They're almost uncountable. Where did the computer come from? 1940s got better and better. But is it anything like today's computational power that you hold in your hand in a telephone? Hardly. So many things, one innovation after another. The invention of the transistor in 1946. Superconductivity, which was my field of specialty, that was a curiosity in the lab from about 1911 onward, and people couldn't figure out what it was all about. And with brilliant innovation, three guys in 1957 came up with a theory that explains it. And since then, superconductivity has become rather important. If you ever get an MRI where you're sticking your head inside this big machine, what's going on in there is wire carrying current in a superconducting milieu. So superconductivity has this application to medicine that people don't even know it's there, but it is an important application. And there are all kinds of applications of other things too. When I speak of superconductivity, that's because it's my specialty, but you talk to another guy and he'll be able to cite innovations of many types. But the innovative thinking that has characterized human beings is something we can all be kind of proud of because it reflects mankind's creative ability. And if you want me to make a prediction about the future, I think it's that God has accepted mankind as God's partner in future creations. The future that unfolds before us, I think, will be considerably affected by the fact that mankind, along with God, is sharing in creation. And I see that as a very positive sign. But that's one of the realities of innovations that as they come along. I can give you examples. I can tell you my own limited experience, but just to look at the world around us and just ask anything about it, the number of innovations is just astonishing.
Oh, that's great. Finally, Tom, for our listeners who are intrigued by this conversation and want to dive deeper into your ideas, what's the best place for them to go get your book, Everywhen?
Okay, everybody gets it on Amazon. Now, I mentioned that it has been machine translated into a whole bunch of other languages, and I have a Chinese colleague who reads English as well as Chinese, and he says this is a good translation. So, congratulations to the machine translation algorithms. But you can get it in French, Spanish, German, and everything else. But basically, most people are happy to read it in English, which means you go to Amazon and there's a page there. It'll say Everywhen, God, Symmetry and Time. That's the title. And my name is Tom Sheahen, or Thomas P. Sheahen. And you put those two together when you're on the Amazon page, and it's going to pop up right away. And there you find a description of what's in the book, table of contents, a little background. You're allowed to read. Nice thing about Amazon, they let you read about 10% of any book. Okay. You can definitely make a dent in this book for free, but if you want to buy it, then it's $20. If you need motivation to buy it, well, on the website, there's a whole bunch of reviews. If you click on the stars, then that brings you to a whole page full of reviews and you can see what people think of it. So there is, in my experience, a lot of pretty happy people who have spoken to me and said, gee, this gave me a really good idea. I didn't understand this. But what I'm trying to do with the book, and what I'm trying to do tonight, is not so much make $20 for selling one copy of the book, hardly. It's to get people to start thinking, to get your thinking to step up to a higher level, to where you start to ask questions, including questions about God, and begin to look for insights of your own in which you understand at a higher level. You get beyond the idea that God exists within time. That's a first elementary step. But in these higher levels of thinking, with your imagination, your understanding, and your willingness to reach to a higher level, you can go far beyond what I've written, because I have written as a human being. But the ability of human beings to think at a higher level is unlimited. So my idea of the book, hopefully, is that it will cause people to take these upward steps and to start thinking at a higher level. And I think that a person who does that will be richly rewarded with a better understanding of all kinds of things about our nature, science, about faith, about human reality, and in particular about God. And I hope that readers will find it worthwhile to follow that path.
Wonderful, wonderful. Tom, it's been a really, really great conversation with you here today, and I'm excited to have you on the show.
Well, I appreciate very much you having me, and I hope that I've been able to make a little contribution to you. Thank you.
You sure did.